Hello everyone, good morning. Today we are talking about Venerable Huixu, who was a bhikkhuni from ancient China, and it seems that she was an intersex person. So we have very few stories about intersex people in the early Buddhist texts, and so this is very unique. And today we are going to have a look at her biography. Before we start, we will chant the Namo Tassa as usual. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, welcome to the live audience and welcome to everybody who has joined in online. Over the course of the last few weeks or maybe even months during this Vasa time, we have looked at role models in quite a lot of detail. So we had a very long course about the outstanding bhikkhunis in the Buddha's time. And the last few weeks, we've also been looking at the chief lay disciples. So 2 chief lay disciples from the men and 2 chief lay women. And we have studied their life and their contributions to Buddhism. And one thing that I found very inspiring while studying, especially the lay disciples, or especially the 8 pairs of chief disciples, the 2 bhikkhus, the 2 bhikkhunis, and then the 4 lay people, is the diversity that we see in those texts and the diversity that those people represent. So we have seen that they come from all classes of society. We've seen that there were royals and that there were high caste Brahmins among the chief disciples, but then there was a slave woman. So it really spans the entire spectrum of social classes. There were merchants and so on. So it was very diverse. And we have seen that there were people who were healthy, there were people who had disabilities. We have seen there were people of different skin tones and people of different genders. So especially men and women are represented exactly equally among the chief disciples, 50% each. So it's a very beautiful, a very, very inspiring diversity. But one thing we haven't seen so far when we talk about gender and when we talk about sex characteristics, so the bodily anatomy, we haven't seen people who fall outside the binary. So today we want to look at a story of somebody who is outside that binary structure. And especially because in October is actually LGBT History Month. So in order to celebrate the History Month, we are today looking at the story of a bhikshuni from ancient China who appears to have been intersex. So this story is from the 5th century CE. And the story is found in a collection of biographies of ancient nuns, which is called, well, obviously, Biography of Buddhist Nuns. And it's found in English translation in a book called The Lives of Great Monks and Nuns. And I have the book here. So this is what it looks like if you have the printed book. And I've put a link in the description box to the PDF. So if you want to read along, you can download the PDF and read with us. And this will be on page 128, sorry. And in this collection of biographies, there are actually 65 stories or biographies of the nuns in China. And this was collected, these nuns have lived over the course of 2 centuries. So from the 4th, so basically in the 4th and the 5th century and at the beginning of the 6th century. And this was compiled by a monk called Venerable Baochang. And this was a very, very fascinating time in ancient China. Buddhism had already been introduced at this point, but this was the time when, for example, bhikkhuni ordination or bhikshuni ordination was introduced in China. So this first, we see that the first nuns described in the book were ordained with a monk's ordination only, so with a quorum of monks only, and that was considered a valid ordination. And at some later point, bhikkhunis came from Sri Lanka, and then they carried out dual ordinations. So it's a very interesting case study of how a bhikshuni order was introduced into a new country. And obviously that's interesting also for us nowadays, where we have a little bit of discussion about bhikkhunis, or we had a little bit of discussion about bhikkhunis. I feel like the discussion has died down now, but it's a very, very interesting to compare the modern time with that time in ancient China. And I think we're extremely lucky that we have this text, because we have so few stories about how also bhikkhus, but especially bhikkhunis, lived in those ancient times. So we are very lucky that this collection of 65 biographies was preserved. So today we are reading one of those biographies. And of course, this is a Chinese text, originally written in China, not translated from an Indian original. So it's very, very different in style from the Indian texts that you may be used to. So I just want to invite you to be open-minded about this and to be respectful to the ancient text, even if it might be slightly different from what you're used to with the usual texts. And of course, feel free to leave any comments and questions in the chat that you may have. Since this is an LGBTQIA+ topic, please make sure that the space remains welcoming and that you keep your comments friendly and respectful. So we will start, as I mentioned, on page 126. And this is the story of Huixu, Venerable Huixu of Qishan Nunnery. So the story begins. Huixu, originally surnamed Zhou, was a native of Gaoping in Luqiu. So first of all, I want to say apologies to everybody who is a native speaker of Chinese. I did not look up all the tones for all the pinyin in this story, so I might be mispronouncing some of the things. So apologies. It's just there's too many pinyin words, and I was too lazy. So apologies, but I think we can still follow the story. And of course, so right from the start, we see this is very different from an Indian text. Here, the Venerable is identified with her ordained name, with her lay name, and exactly where she lived, in which district, in which city. So in ancient China, of course, there was a lot more emphasis on preserving exact facts as compared to India, where everything was a little bit more flexible, and there was a lot of storytelling and a lot of mythology coming into text. But in China, everything is much more factual based. So this was much more important to the ancient Chinese people. And then the story continues. She was a noble and straightforward person with an inaccessible air, and looked more like a man than a woman. And so this is her description. Her physical appearance was, she looked like a man, not like a woman. When we look at the Chinese original text, the Chinese actually says she looked like a man. She did not resemble a woman. So this seems to describe somebody who might either be intersex or who might be a non-binary person who has a female anatomy but tries to appear more male because they don't identify quite with their gender that they were born in. And so the text isn't specific. The reason why I think that she was intersex instead of being non-binary is that if you are non-binary, you can try to appear more androgynous or try to appear more male by dressing in a certain style, by having a certain hairstyle, by applying certain makeup or using certain accessories. But as monks and nuns, that's not really possible. We wear exactly the same clothes. We have exactly the same hairstyle, which is no hair whatsoever. We don't wear makeup, we don't have accessories, so we don't actually change the physical appearance that we have. For this reason, if there is a person who looks male, then probably that is because they have a male anatomy. So she was ordained as a bhikkhuni or as a bhikshuni. She was a Mahayana bhikshuni. So clearly that must have meant that she has sexual characteristics, that her private parts were female enough to be ordained as a woman or as a bhikshuni, not as a bhikshu. But if she looks male, that probably means she was tall. Maybe she even had a beard. We don't know that. Like, we don't have any more description. It's just that when people looked at her, they saw a man and they didn't really see a woman. That's what the text says. So, but it's very clear that she was ordained, and she is included in a text of outstanding bhikkhunis. This is a text that's supposed to celebrate the lives of the great bhikkhunis that lived in this time. So clearly she was very much respected in that time, and her sexual appearance did not pose any kind of obstacle to her being ordained. Or her physical appearance did not pose any kind of obstacle to her being ordained. And then the text continues, her words and speech were very frank and upright, never dodging anything. Oh, and one more thing that I wanted to mention here in this text, obviously we use female pronouns for her, she and her pronouns. This is something that the translator added in the story. The original Chinese text does not use pronouns, does not use gendered pronouns. Ancient Chinese does not have third-person gendered pronouns. So the translator is probably using the she, her pronouns for this person because it's a bhikshuni. So that may have been an obvious choice. Since she seems not to have, like, since she was obviously intersex, it may have been better to use other pronouns, but I'm just going to keep the pronouns as they are in the text now. Just wanted to mention that the original Chinese does not have gendered pronouns here. So, and when she was 7, she became a vegetarian and kept fasts with a firm and steadfast mind. So, in modern Mahayana, obviously, pretty much all the monastics are vegetarian, or most of the monastics are vegetarian. But at this time, in the early period, what we can see from this collection of texts, when we also read the stories of the other 64 nuns, is that many of them were vegetarian, but not all of them. And being vegetarian was highly praised. It was considered very, very ethical, but it wasn't a mandatory standard at this point in time. So the fact that she was vegetarian was something praiseworthy and outstanding, and obviously considered very ethical and very compassionate thing to do, but not necessarily something that was followed by all monastics at this time. And at the age of 18, she left home to live as a nun at Sanzhen Nunnery in Jingzhou. So yeah, she went forth at 18. 18 is a good age to go forth, of course, because you can take full ordination at 20 if you're not married. And usually there's a 2-year preparation period. So if you go forth at 18, you can get full ordination at the earliest possible time when you're 20. And she observed the Vinaya rules in a perfect manner, winning the praise of both clergy and lay people. So she was highly respected at that time. At that time, there was at Jiangling a recluse nun who enjoyed a reputation for virtue in the western part of the country. On seeing Huixu, the recluse considered her an unusual person. Despite the difference in their ages, the two practiced the way together companionably. They stayed in the same place for one summer, practicing the Pratyutpana Samadhi, exerting themselves mentally and physically day and night without rest. So here we see the first practice that she's doing. Obviously, she's drawn to a reclusive lifestyle. She enjoys doing meditation and practicing deep samadhi. Again, it is mentioned that she was an unusual person, that she looked quite unusual. And they were practicing a kind of samadhi that is called pratyutpana samadhi. This is very likely a reference to a Mahayana sutra called the Pratyutpana Samadhi Sutra, which is one of the earliest, or one very early Mahayana sutra. And it was translated into Chinese a few centuries even before Venerable Huixu was living. And this sutta contains the first known mention of Amitabha Buddha and his Pure Land. So this was definitely one of the origins of Pure Land Buddhism in China. And the practice that they were doing, Pratyutpana Samadhi practice, this is or seems to, from the description that I have read, it seems to have been, or it seems to still be, a very demanding practice of samadhi. You constantly keep calling Amitabha Buddha to mind. And about a century later, after Huixu was living, this was developed into a full practice, as apparently it is still practiced today. So I'm not an expert on this. I've just read up on this. I've never practiced this myself. And in the fully developed version of this practice, which developed a century after Huixu's life, this is a practice that takes 90 days, and you constantly bring Amitabha Buddha to mind, and you do that without resting. So if you really practice this in the way it was designed, and you don't sit down and you don't lie down for 90 days. So I'm not quite sure how that is done. It seems pretty extreme. But that's what the description said. Anyway, it does seem like a very demanding form of practice, and it does seem that Huixu was drawn to this fairly austere lifestyle. And as I mentioned, this fully developed practice was not yet developed at the time when Huixu was living. But they seem to be doing something similar here, because it says they practice it for one summer. One summer usually means for one summer retreat. And in the Chinese text, what we call Vasa, in the Indian text is often called the summer retreat in China. So it's possible that they were spending one Vasa together doing this practice. And of course, one Vasa is also 3 months, so roughly 90 days. So it's quite possible that they were doing something very similar to what was described in the later fully developed practice. Anyway, it does seem to be quite demanding and quite difficult to do. And then when Shen Yoju was the prefectural governor, he enforced a general selective elimination of monks and nuns. Huixu went to the capital in order to avoid the calamity. When Shen had failed and fallen from power, she returned to the west. So we see it was a pretty difficult time for Buddhism. Sometimes it could be a very difficult time, especially for the monastics. There were political leaders who were not in favor of Buddhism. So of course, Buddhism in China was competing with other religions too, such as Taoism and Confucianism. And occasionally these things happened, and governors tried to eliminate monks and nuns. So I assume that means he tried to assassinate them if they didn't flee in time. But eventually, as the story goes here, he failed and she came back to that country. So it was a pretty dangerous time back then. It could be very violent also in that area of China. So religious freedom wasn't necessarily a guarantee back then. But then things got better for her, and the story continues. Xiao Yi, the prince of Yuchang, who was the chancellor of military affairs and minister of war of the Qi dynasty, went to serve as garrison commander in the regions of Jing and Shan at the end of the Shangming period of the Song dynasty. So this was 477 to 479 CE. And as I mentioned, in China, everything is much more fact-based than in India. So we can actually date all these descriptions with high accuracy, and we know the exact years when this took place. And so this prince was obviously a very high-ranking person. He was the Minister of War and the Chancellor of Military Affairs. So I'm not very much familiar with military structures. It seems a little bit weird that someone who is the Minister of War serves as a garrison commander. It seems like that would be a demotion. Yeah, I can't really explain that, but I'm assuming that that was some kind of high prestige position at that point in time. And so anyway, this prince seems to have been a strong supporter of Buddhism. Knowing that Huixu was a person of religious practice, he invited her to his official residence and provided her with the 4 requisites. So here we have a prince, a royal, who is very respectful towards bhikshunis and who is very supportive of Huixu. At that time, the jhana master Xuanchang came down from the region of Shu to the region of Qing. Huixu learned the methods of meditation from him and made a thorough study of the subtle mysteries. Xuanchang often praised her, saying that her religious practice in her former existence had not been superficial. So here again we see her interest in meditation and deep samadhi practice, and in the practice of jhanas. So this isn't necessarily a given for all the nuns that are included in this collection of texts. And not all the nuns there practiced meditation. Some of them were considered outstanding nuns for other achievements that they had. So here, having someone who is actually a deep jhana practitioner is not all that common, just as nowadays it's not all that common to find people who are very, very proficient in jhana, but she apparently also brought good habits from her former life, and she apparently had already practiced that. So she was able to attain very deep states in this life fairly quickly when she studied with Xuanchang, the jhana master. So she was not only proficient in the practice of meditation, but was also a vegetarian and led a life of strict morality. We've already heard that. This was described before already. Because of this, the wife of the Prince of Yujiang, so this same prince that we just talked about, the Minister of War, and the other female members of the royal family highly venerated her and learned the methods of meditation from her. So she had access to the royal family, and she became a teacher of the palace ladies there. So she was apparently also quite proficient at teaching others, and she was very respected as a teacher. Whenever Huixu received any gifts, she would distribute them to others at once, never hoarding anything for herself. Her mind was magnanimous and far-reaching, and she never concerned herself about her own living. So yeah, again, she seems to have been a person who liked to live very simply. We have already seen that she was drawn to a reclusive life. And she didn't hoard any possessions. She probably had very few possessions, and she was very generous and shared everything with others. And Prince Xiaoyi, that's the same prince as before, invited her to return with him to the capital, where he built a vihara for her named Fujian Nunnery on the eastern estate of the royal family. She often went to the royal residence to practice the way. So apparently the royal family, the prince, were so much drawn to her and were so much supportive of her that they asked her to come with them to the capital, and they built a monastery for her on the premises of the royal compound. And it's mentioned here that she often went to the royal residence, which means that she probably also had a bit of political influence here. So one thing we see here is that they were very respectful towards nuns. So there was we don't see any kind of gender discrimination in this text. And this is actually one of the very inspiring features of this collection of texts. As I mentioned, we don't have that many stories of the lives of nuns in ancient times. But in this collection of texts, what we see is that they're really, when we read the other stories also, we don't get the impression that there was any kind of gender discrimination. There's no mention of the Garudamas, and the relationships between the male and the female Sangha the way it is described seems to be very, very equal and very respectful towards each other. And also lay people were very supportive of the practice of the bhikshunis. And here we even see a bhikshuni who had influence in the royal compound and in the royal residences. So in this, for this Qi dynasty. In the 9th year of Yongming, which was 491 CE, Huixu said that she was suddenly suffering from illness, but there was no symptom of real sickness except that she refused to take food. She became haggard in appearance and bitterly begged to return to her nunnery. As soon as she returned to the nunnery, she became quite well. So apparently she's not enjoying staying at the royal residence. And personally, I can relate to that very much. And I think many monastics can relate to that very much, that it's not that pleasant to stay in a lay environment long term. Some of the others are smiling and nodding. Yeah, as a monastic, even though maybe a lay residence, especially a royal compound, may be a lot more cushy and comfortable than a monastery. It's just the mindset of people is very different, and it's not an atmosphere where people practice deep Dhamma usually. Usually people are quite distracted, especially in royal compounds, distracted with sense pleasures and with political matters and so on. So it's not that pleasant to stay there long term if you really have a mind that inclines to Dhamma practice. So I understand that why she felt sick. Probably this was a psychosomatic illness, because as it is described, there was no real symptom. And when she returned to the nunnery, she recovered very quickly. Anyway, 10 days later, she was again invited to the royal residence. And she was ill again, as before, but again, nobody knew why. So everybody here is laughing. But shortly afterwards, when the prince had passed away, calamities and misfortunes befell his family one after another. In the vicinity of the Eastern Estate, so the Eastern Estate was the royal compound where they built her vihara. So in the vicinity of the Eastern Estate, Emperor Wu of the Qi dynasty constructed another convent, Qishan Nunnery, and brought all the nuns from Fujian to live in it. So Fujian was the previous nunnery that they built. So here we see even the emperor himself was very interested in her practice, and he was very supportive of her. And he also constructed a new monastery for her and made all the nuns move from the old nunnery to the new place. Meanwhile, Fujian Nunnery, so that's the old nunnery, was used separately to lodge foreign monks and masters. So I think this is also very interesting, that they built a special, or that they used a special monastery for foreign monks and masters who came. And this, of course, tells us that at this time there was quite a vibrant exchange. Monks, especially monks, maybe also nuns, coming and going from other Buddhist countries, probably especially from Central Asia and from Gandhara and so on. So there was a lot of exchange and new ideas coming into China, and Buddhism seems to have been well supported at this time and seems to have been flourishing. And the royal family seems to have had an active interest in promoting that by providing accommodation for those monks and masters. The royal family also continued to offer alms to those who were good at reciting and chanting charms and spells. So I'm not quite sure what this refers to. Reciting and chanting charms and spells isn't usually something that is praised in Buddhism. That rather seems like a superstitious practice. So I'm not totally sure if this refers to Buddhist practices or if this refers to non-Buddhist practices and just means that the royal family also supported people who practiced other religions. Because in the other stories of this collection, like the other 64 biographies, reciting charms and spells isn't something that's usually mentioned. So this doesn't seem to have been a very popular practice at this point in time. So it's not something that nuns or monks were expected to do or that people thought was praiseworthy. So I'm assuming that this just means that the royal family also supported other religions. After Huixu went to live at Xishan Nunnery, she did not set foot in the royal residence again for several years. So we see that she really wasn't drawn to staying with the royal family for longer periods of time. People from within and outside the residence highly respected this nun and often exhorted her to pay a short visit to the inner chambers of the royal house. When Lady Chu probably was a member of the royal household, wished to invite the nuns to accept alms of food, she first sent a messenger to consult with and invite Huixu, who said, very good. So we see even though she didn't come for a few years, she was still very highly respected. And when they wanted to have an almsgiving ceremony, she was the first one they invited, and she was the one they consulted with, basically how to arrange things and who to invite and how to do those kind of ceremonies, I assume. And yeah, I think that one reason why Huixu was so reluctant to go back to the royal residence is because we have seen she was a very strong jhana practitioner, and she was very much drawn to reclusive practice and to practicing of deep meditation. And obviously a royal palace isn't the best environment for doing that. So Huixu said, very good. As I am getting old and weak, I really wish at this moment to go to the royal house once to bid farewell to the various good ladies. So she went to the royal residence to take part in the function. After it was over, she asked for paper and writing brush and composed this poem. To those who know me not, my name is Old Joe. Being invited to attend a 7-day rite, I'll not put an end to the ceremony of insight. So here, again, we see a tradition that seems to tie in very nicely with traditions we see from India, which is composing inspired verses or poems for special occasions. So in the suttas, we also see the Buddha himself often speaking gathas, or other monks and nuns doing that. We have entire collections of poems of monks and nuns from India. And it seems that this was also a practice that was done in China. And Huixu seems to have been quite proficient in that, and she composed this poem for the royal ladies. And she says, in the first kind of 2 lines, she introduces herself. She says her name is Old Joe. So Joe obviously was her name in lay life. Presumably she's doing this to be humble and a little bit self-deprecating, saying she's Old Joe. And then she says, being invited to attend a 7-day rite, I'll not put an end to the ceremony of insight. So she draws a parallel between the 7-day rite that she has just attended and what she calls the ceremony of insight, which I assume is her Buddhist practice of developing insight for, of course, a longer period of time, not just for a 7-day rite. So I think the mention of 7-day rites, this is probably a mention of funeral rites. So this is very, very common in Buddhist cultures, both in Theravada and in Mahayana countries. If somebody has passed away, you carry out a 7-day ceremony for the person who has passed away. So maybe this dana offering that the Lady Chu was offering was on the occasion of somebody's passing. And so anyway, Huixu says she will not put an end to the ceremony of insight. As we will see in a moment, she sees that the end of her life is approaching. She's already old. And of course, as she is a Mahayana practitioner and a Bodhisattva practitioner, she probably wasn't aspiring for arahantship in this life. So, and a Bodhisattva path obviously is always thought of as, continuing over many lifetimes. So probably she wasn't too worried about not being able to put an end to the ceremony of insight in this life. But she was also probably stating that there was still more for her to be done, that she hadn't attained everything that she was aspiring to attain. So again, she's being quite humble here. And then here we have a note from the author of this text, the Venerable Bao Chang. And he says, there were 10 more characters expressing farewell, but I have forgotten them. So the poem is incomplete. People are again smiling. And I think this is just really a beautiful note of the author of the text, to show how much he was committed to transmitting things accurately and to portraying the nuns in like the most accurate fashion. And he was obviously traveling that region and collecting the stories of those nuns in the 6th century. So he was talking to people, collecting stories. He was talking to monastics, and also probably going through writings that they had in monasteries, and maybe stories that were collected in those monasteries. And maybe he did see that poem that was written. Like, it seems that he saw this poem, because he says there were 10 more characters, so obviously he must have seen it. But it's just so beautiful that he's trying to be so accurate that he's even telling the readers that he forgot a few stanzas of this poem, or probably only one stanza of this poem. 10 characters. Yeah, and then the story continues. After writing the poem, Huixu talked and smiled with the people, not differing in the least from her usual lofty demeanor. When she took leave of them, she said, "My return to my nunnery this time is our eternal parting. I'm getting old, and there will be no further reason for me to come to the royal house again." So it seems that she feels that her death is approaching. And she was then quite healthy, but a month or so after returning to her nunnery, she fell ill. She did not alter her usual activities and died in a few days, on the 20th day of the 11th month of the first year of Yongyuan, which is 499 CE. Huixu was then 69 years old. Zhou wrote a eulogistic epitaph in honor of her. So we see that she had some kind of feeling that her death was approaching. She was announcing it. And then, and then fairly quickly after that, she did actually pass away, without having a long period of sickness or anything. And this kind of sort of feeling of knowing that one's death is approaching is also something that's very common in this collection of texts. And in many of the other stories, of the other biographies of the other nuns, it's actually a lot more detailed than what we have here. Often they have premonitions, often they have auspicious dreams, either they themselves or people close to them, or they have visions of where they're going to go to be reborn. So apparently it was considered something that would happen to people who were outstanding nuns or even outstanding monks. We don't have that many stories of outstanding monks, but in those stories of outstanding nuns, that's true. People here are laughing, but that's actually true. Like, this is a collection of 65 biographies of nuns, but we don't actually have anything comparable for the monks. And people are smiling and nodding and liking this, okay? Anyway, so it's quite common for them to have some kind of miraculous event happen towards the end of their life. For Huixu, it's fairly down to earth. She just had this kind of feeling that she was her life was coming to an end, and then she actually passed away. And then there is a little paragraph at the end that says, there was also the nun Dershang, who had the same virtue and shared the same aim as Huixu, and was her sister in the Dharma. She practiced the way and trained herself in contemplation under Huixu's personal instruction. So again, here we see that Huixu was also a respected teacher. She was teaching meditation to other nuns, and other nuns, not only the lay people, but also other nuns, respected her and thought that she was somebody they could learn from, and took her as a teacher. So I think it's very beautiful that was included, to show us that she was also deeply valued by other nuns and taken as a teacher. So this is the end of her biography. I hope you enjoyed reading this, even though it's quite different from Indian texts. I really like this story because it shows us how somebody who had a very unusual appearance wasn't reduced to that appearance. It's just something that's mentioned in the text, but then the text moves on and really focuses on her life and celebrates her story. So it really shows us that appearance doesn't matter, and that is really the internal development that counts. And here we celebrate her attainments in meditation, her lifestyle, and how much she was respected by people, even by the royal family, even by the emperor himself. So we really don't see any trace of any kind of discrimination based on gender or based on sex characteristics or anything. Not any discrimination against women, but also not any discrimination against people who are outside of the usual binary spectrum or binary polar ends, somewhere on the spectrum in between. So I think this is just a very beautiful story, and I think it's good to have these positive role models of people who are somewhat unusual, and to also celebrate their lives and not just talk about people who clearly fall inside the two polar ends of the binary. So the men and the women. So I really was very happy when I found this story, and I think it's just very beautiful to celebrate diversity in the Sangha and to see that diversity was always there in the Sangha historically, and probably all throughout the ages, and of course also in modern times. We have a very diverse Sangha, and of course we have people similar to Huixu also in the Sangha, and I think that is wonderful, and that's really a cause to be celebrated, a cause for celebration. And at this point, I think I'm going to end for today. And if you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them.
Andamayang Dhammakataya Sadhukarang Namaste
Sadhu, 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 Anumodami. So I see quite a few comments in the chat. Let me go through and see what you have posted. Okay, I see a lot of emojis. One person, Chitso Ong, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, left a huge amount of emojis here. And one person, Liz, welcome Liz, I'm so glad. Gita is also here and says she enjoyed the story. Buddha Ruchi says chants and spells for the benefit of ghosts and other suffering beings are incorporated into the Chinese morning and evening services, purportedly codified in the Tang Dynasty. Yeah, so the Tang Dynasty was a little bit later than the text that we read just now, I believe. I should read up on my Chinese history. I think the Tang Dynasty was a little bit later, like 1 or 2 centuries later. But yeah, it's of course possible that they had that those were practices that were ongoing throughout the history of in China, and that at the Tang Dynasty they were codified, but they were already being in use in centuries before. Thank you for sharing that. And Buddha Ruchi also says, interesting to note that modern Chinese Buddhist practice demands vegetarianism. I wonder about our bhikshuni's time. Yeah, as I mentioned in the text, it is specifically mentioned that she was a vegetarian, and that is also mentioned in the biographies of quite a number of the other outstanding nuns, but not in all of the biographies. So it seems that that was a practice that was considered highly praiseworthy and with special mention. In our text, it was actually mentioned twice. So it seems to have been highly praiseworthy, but it wasn't universally practiced. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any need to include it to the story as one outstanding feature of those particular nuns. So apparently, that was something that was considered good, but wasn't a mandatory practice for everyone. And Buddha-ruchi also says, within the Amitabha Sutras, we read that it is absolutely necessary to keep the precepts along with the chanting and reflecting on Amitabha. While I don't practice Pure Land Buddhism myself, although I've participated in Pure Land retreats in New York and in Taiwan, I deeply appreciate your presentation here. Thank you. And yeah, I think precepts are absolutely necessary for all kinds of Buddhist practice. I don't think you can develop in any kind of samadhi, whether that is Pure Land, this pratyutpana samadhi practice we've seen in this sutra, or any other kind of samadhi, like samma samadhi, any kind of samma samadhi, without keeping precepts, because precepts is just the basis for creating a wholesome mind, and for making your mind fairly calm and at peace within oneself. And if you don't have a strong precept practice, you can still have a little bit of samadhi, but to actually go very deep only works if you have a strong basis of sila. And yeah, then a few people are rejoicing. Liz enjoyed it. Buddha-ruchi enjoyed it also. Oh, so many people enjoyed it. I see so many emojis here. Okay, that's wonderful. Are there any questions from the in-person audience here? No? Okay, then I think we can finish for today. Thank you all for keeping the comment section welcoming and friendly towards everybody. I really appreciate that when we have topics like this one. And then we can finish for today with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join in at home if you like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and come back this evening for monk chat if you're interested.